In this video, we're going to take a look at different types of measurements, what you can measure in an object, its length, mass, and volume. And then we'll take a look at the different systems of measurement that we can work in, either the English system or the metric system, and then compare both of the systems and talk about why the metric system is used primarily in the science and medical field. And then you will be introduced to the most basic units in the metric system, the meter, the gram, and the liter. This video is tagged as basic. It's got the little green tag up there, which means there's really no pre-knowledge that you need to understand this video, and the material that's covered in this video is fairly at a beginner level. All the videos are tagged as either basic in green, uh, intermediate in blue, or advanced in purple. And then how they're tagged just lets you know how much background information you need to know about the topic to understand it, and then also just in general how difficult the material is. So let's get started. So when we're looking at measuring something, there's really three things or three components that you can measure about an object. You can measure its length, its mass, and its volume. So imagine if you had a hollowed out Rubik's Cube, and we wanted to see, well, what could we measure about that hollowed out Rubik's Cube? So if we draw a cube here, and we pretend that it's a hollow cube so that you can fill it with something like this, and then I'll just put something on the bottom there to show that it does have a solid ground on the bottom there, a solid floor, but the rest of it is hollowed out. Well, there's three things that you can measure about this cube, and it's three things you can measure about any object that you have. The first thing is you can measure its length. So if we want to measure its length, we might measure its length and find that it's, if we take a ruler, might find that it's 1 inch on each side. So doing that, we're measuring the length of this object. Another component of the object that you can measure is how much does it weigh, its mass. So if we take that cube and then we put it on a scale and see what reading we get on the scale, it might read something like 100 grams. And the unit that it's measuring in is in grams. It could be grams, pounds, all different types of units, but for this example, we'll say it's measuring it in grams. Well, if you do that, you're measuring the mass of the object. And then the third and final thing that you can measure about the object is how much space does it take up? How much space does it occupy? And for solid objects, a very easy way to do this is by seeing how much water will fit into it. That's its volume. So if you have a glass of water and you then take that water and pour it into the cube, the empty cube here, and see how much water it takes to fill that cube. Maybe it takes, I don't know, 50 milliliters. I'm just making these numbers up there. 50 milliliters to fill that cube up. That 50 milliliters would be the volume of the cube, or how much space that cube occupies. So as we saw for the example here with this cube, you can measure three things with it. You can measure its length, how long it is. You can measure its mass, how heavy it is, and you can measure its volume, how much space it occupies. So for any object, those are the three things that you can measure. So whenever we say we're doing a measurement, you always want to ask yourself, well, what am I measuring? Am I measuring its length, its volume, or its mass? Now, there's lots of different units that you can measure something in, and what unit you choose to measure something is dependent upon how large the object is that you're measuring. So let's just say we're looking at measuring length, and let's say we have a pencil. Okay, so we have a little pencil, and you're asked to measure that pencil. Well, if you want to measure the length of the pencil, you're going to pick something that it has relatively small increments of length to measure it with. So say something like an inch. So if you take a ruler and you measure this pencil in inches, maybe it is 6 inches long. Now you're not going to measure it in miles, because if you measure that pencil in miles, it might end up being something like 0.00001 mile long. So, for measuring a pencil, a mile is not an appropriate unit to measure it in because it's a large measuring unit. An inch would be something good that's appropriate for measuring a pencil in. Now, something that would be good for a mile is, let's say you're looking at somewhere in the United States here. And let's say you're looking at Pennsylvania and you're looking at the state of Florida, and you want to measure the distance between Pennsylvania and Florida. Well, if you were going to measure that in inches, you might end up with something like 236, 000, 000 inches. So 236 million inches to get from Pennsylvania to Florida. So that's not a good unit to measure that length in because it's a very large length, and inches are calibrated very smallly, very shortly. So you'd rather use a mile. So you might end up finding that it's about 1,750 miles between Pennsylvania and Florida. So in this case, when you're measuring a very large distance, like the distance between two states, you're going to want to use something like a mile. Which is used for measuring long distances. But if you're measuring the distance of a pencil, you're going to want to use something like an inch, which is used for very short distances. So now that we've talked about the what you can measure in an object, you can measure its length, its mass, and its volume. And then we also talked about, how you decide what you use to measure something based on, this. You decide based on the size of the object. Now we want to kind of take a look at comparing the two different systems of measurement: the English system, which is also called the imperial system, and the metric system. In the field of science and the healthcare industry, almost everything is measured in the metric system. So we're going to need to learn how to measure things in metric and convert within the metric system. However, in the United States, almost everything is measured using the English system. So if you're in a non-science field or a non-healthcare field, and you're asked to measure something or you're given a measurement, it's probably going to be in English units. But then if you go into a hospital or a scientific environment, you're going to be measuring stuff in metric units. So not only do we need to be comfortable with measuring in the metric system, but because we live in the United States, we're also probably going to need to be able to convert back and forth between the English and the metric system. So why is the metric system used in science and the healthcare field? It's because it's actually a lot easier to convert back and forth within. And to kind of give an example of that, let's just take a look at some English units and how they convert back and forth with each other. So if I have 12 inches, and we're probably already familiar with this, that's equal to 1 foot. Well, why is it 12 to 1? Why isn't it 6 to 1 or 5 to 1 or 10 to 1? This ratio or relationship between these two units is called its conversion factor. And the conversion factors in the English system are all over the place. You just got to memorize all the different numbers because they don't make any sense. Why is it 12 to 1? Why isn't it 8 to 1? Whereas conversion factors in the metric system are much more rational. They all use factors of 10. So it's a lot easier to remember how to go from a smaller metric unit to a larger metric unit. So another example of a conversion factor, if I wanted to know dollars and quarters, there's 4 quarters in every $1. That's a conversion factor of 4 to 1. It's just telling you how the two units are related to each other. There's going to be lots of cases in chemistry where you need to know conversion factors so that you can convert back and forth between two different units. So, kind of getting on with this English system and why the conversion factors are so weird. If you have 3 feet, that's equal to 1 yard. So, inch is kind of the smallest measuring unit for the English system. Then foot is a little bit bigger. Then yard is a little bit bigger. And then, if you want to get into the largest one, you're looking at a mile. And there's 5,280 feet in 1 mile. Why in the heck is it 5,280? Why couldn't they pick something simpler than that? Well, the reason is, it's kind of strange, is back in 1592 in Great Britain, Parliament decided that they want to standardize the length of a mile. So they decided to make a mile equal to 8 furlongs. And a furlong is how fast a horse can run during a horse race. So I guess back in the 1500s, they were really big into horse racing. So the problem with that is a mile was set to being equal to 8 furlongs. And really what that does then is, well, then when we started to use feet, well, they had to say, well, how many furlongs is equal to feet? Well, 8 furlongs is actually equal to 5,280 feet. So the reason why 5,280 feet is equal to 1 mile is because back in 1592, the British government decided to measure a mile based on how fast a horse could run in furlongs. So it makes no logic or sense whatsoever. It's just a conversion factor, 1,000 or 5,280 that you just have to memorize. It doesn't make any logical sense whatsoever. But if we take a look at the conversion factors for the metric system, they're a lot easier to follow and understand. So if we just kind of keep looking at length here, we could do the same thing for uh, volume or mass as well. But the basic unit for measuring length in the metric system is a meter. And if you wanted, and a meter is about 3 feet. And the reason I tell you that is just so that if you're doing some type of a calculation and you get an answer, you can tell, well, does that answer kind of make sense? So if I say, well, tell me how many meters long this car is, and you come up with an answer of that car is 0.002 meters long, that doesn't make any sense. A car should be somewhere between maybe 2 to 4 meters long based on how big the car is. So that's why I tell you about how big a meter is, just so that you have a basic understanding of its size. The basic metric unit for measuring in mass is a gram. And about how heavy is a gram? Well, there is approximately 2.5 grams in 1 penny. So if you had a penny and you held it in your hand, it would weigh about 2.5 grams. That's really light. So when you think of a gram, you're thinking a gram weighs about like what a paper clip would weigh. So if I asked you, well, how much does a car weigh? And you say, well, that car is pretty heavy. It weighs about 15 grams. That should make no sense to you whatsoever. Cars would weigh hundreds of thousands, if not even millions of grams. So grams is a fairly light unit for measuring. And then the metric unit for measuring volume is a liter. Now, this one we're actually kind of fairly familiar with in the United States because all those 2 liter bottles of soda that they sell, well, they're in 2 liter volumes. So if you buy a bottle of soda, it's my poorly drawn bottle of soda there, it's 2 liters. So you should have kind of an idea of about the size or the volume of a liter. Well, now let's take a look for this metric system. We looked at how the conversion factors for the English system were just all over the place. Well, how is the metric system so much better? Well, in the metric system, everything uses conversions of 10. So let's just take a look at, and they put prefixes in front of these base units to either make them larger or smaller. So let's just take a look at one of these prefixes that you could use for the metric system, and we'll take a look at the prefix of kilo. So if we put this prefix kilo in front of the base unit, kilo means 1,000. So if you put kilo in front of the prefix, it's going to make that base unit 1,000 times bigger. All of the prefixes that you can put in front of base units are multiples of 10. This one's a multiple of 10 up to 1,000. So if I say that I have 1 kilometer, put the prefix in front of it, that means I have 1,000 meters. If I say I have 1 kilogram, that means I have something that's 1,000 grams. And if I say I have 1 kiloliter, that means I have 1,000 liters. You can see there's a lot less memorizing between the conversion factors. The conversion factor between kilo and the base unit is just 1,000 to 1. Now, in the metric system, there's literally dozens of different prefixes that you can put in front of the base unit. And it's just making, you can make something a billionth of the size, or a billion times the size, or a millionth of the size, or a million times the size, or a tenth of the size, or 10 times the size. And it's all based on the prefix that you put in front of it. And in the next video, we'll start to take a look at some of the more commonly used prefixes and put them in front of the base units, and then start converting, doing some basic conversions between one type of metric unit into another type of metric unit. So if you understood this video and you're comfortable with this material, then you'll be ready to move on to the next video. And I should have a little tab up and at the top of the video there showing you the next video that looks at basic conversions in the metric system using kilos and millis. All right, hope you learned something in the video, and we'll see you in the next one.